What's up guys, Asian here again with another Wolf Hunter PTS theory crafting video, and today we're going to be going over the Magical Warden, and specifically we're just going to kind of be answering a question that some viewers have had about my Magical Warden, how I use her, what abilities that I have. So the question that they were asking basically was about why am I using Elemental Weapon? So this is a copy of my Warden on the PTS. It's EU characters right now, so I don't have an actual copy of my Warden, but this is pretty much the bars that I usually run with. So it's usually Crushing Shock, Ellie Weapon, Fetcher Infection, this is where I put my shield, Inner Light, Eternal Guardian. On my back bar I have Blockade, Winter's Revenge, Blue Betty, Spell Sim, sometimes I'll have Inner Light here again, and then either Trap or Challenge Acceleration, and then I got a double bar the Eternal Guardian obviously. So a lot of people have asked me, well, why don't I use the Screaming Cliff Racer instead of Elemental Weapon? So they both do cost about the same amount of magicka. Screaming Cliff Racer costs a little bit more, but not that much more. And it actually deals more damage, so it deals 9154 compared to 8236. It also has the advantage of, when I'm running Screaming Cliff Racer, of basically increasing my damage done by 2%, an additional 2%. So right now I have 4% because I have the Bear and the Fetcher, but when I add in Screaming Cliff Racer, this will jump up to 6% instead. So there's a lot of people who are asking, why am I using Ellie Weapon instead of Screaming Cliff Racer? Because Screaming Cliff Racer, by all means, it seems stronger, right? It does more damage, costs about the same amount of magicka, it does a little bit more damage the further away you are, so for a range build it's pretty good, and then you get additional 2% damage done. One thing that people don't quite forget about is the Spell Orb passive. So Ellie Weapon will help proc Spell Orb, which deals an additional 43-42 magic damage in this specific scenario. So when you cast 5 Ellie Weapons, you get additional about 4k or so additional magic damage. So if you split that into each proc, into each Ellie Weapon cast, basically it ends up being between 800 to 900 additional damage to each weapon that you use. So the damage ends up being pretty comparable, but with approximately the same amount of magic cost. So Spell Orb does even the playing field a little bit. However, Screaming Cliff Racer still has the advantage of that additional 2% damage done and 15% more damage based on how far the enemy is. So there is that aspect of it behind it too. In addition, Ellie Weapon can also apply Burning Concussive Shield, which helps you DPS. So Burning obviously helps your personal DPS. Concussion helps proc Minor Vulnerability, which is an 8% damage done, or rather 8% damage received by the boss enemy, and this affects everybody in your group. So using Ellie Weapon gives you a little bit better group utility compared to just running Screaming Cliff Racer, which ends up being a little bit more selfish in that regard. So there was a lot of questions kind of asking, why aren't I using Screaming Cliff Racer? So one of the things you have to realize is the damage done passive here. It is not a flat increase to your DPS. So anything that says increased damage done, so anything like Minor Berserk, Major Berserk, or Minor Slayer, Major Slayer, those are not like a 5% boost. So Minor Slayer is not a 5% boost to your DPS. So if you're doing like 20k DPS, it's not going to increase it by 5k. It's not going to bump you up to 21k when you add in Minor Slayer. It is affected by, the damage calculations. So anything that does damage done or damage received, that is all multiplied together. So that's something that you have to keep in mind here. So it's not exactly a 2% increase in damage. It usually ends up being a little bit less, just because of the way the damage calculations are worked out. That being said, it is still obviously a boost to your DPS overall. But the big question is, does this advanced species kind of outweigh the concuss that you get? So if we take a look here let me just swap over to our so I only have one screen right now, so there we go. So this is basically what I did here, comparing birds and Ellie Weapon. So this is on the PTS, so we have 780 CP. We basically the only thing we changed was either we use Ellie Weapon or we use the birds. Now one thing, like I mentioned earlier, was that Ellie Weapon can proc Minor Vulnerability. So I had to correct for that. So basically what I did was I did the parse of the Ellie weapon, and then I adjusted accordingly. So you can see here I took out that minor vulnerability, which gave me an approximate, it's a little bit more conservative, but it is an approximation of my DPS, what it would be if I didn't have any minor vulnerability at all. So that way it's comparable to the birds parses here, which were just straight up parses. So you can see here that even after you correct for minor vulnerability, Ellie weapon still wins out by about 200 or so DPS. It's not a big boost. It's basically within margin of error. You can see here it's about 500 or so standard deviation, so it's clearly within the margin of error. However, the one thing that you have to remember is that minor vulnerability does boost group DPS. Because it is a debuff that's applied directly to the boss. It is not a buff applied to you. So it affects every single person on your team. They get that additional minor vulnerability buff, debuff I should say. So Ellie weapon ends up being a little bit stronger for the group overall compared to birds, even though the damage is comparable overall. So that's really why I run Ellie weapon. It is pretty much comparable DPS, if not a little bit higher, but it just adds a little bit of additional group utility with the additional minor vulnerability procs, the additional concussed procs. So that's really the primary reason why I use Ellie weapons. That doesn't mean you can't use birds. Birds is perfectly fine. It's a perfectly good skill to use, but you will not be able to give the group minor vulnerability. That really isn't that big of an issue for score pushing guilds, mainly because their healers are already running infallible Aether, so you already have really good minor vulnerability uptime. So if you do have a healer who is running IA and your minor vulnerability uptime is pretty high already, then by all means you can swap Ellie weapon out for birds. But some groups don't run IA regularly. So I know Hellfire, we try to run IA as often as we can, but sometimes it won't happen because our healers might not have it, or we might be progressing through something and we want different sets instead of minor vulnerability. We might want Sanctuary or Mending, for instance. So in those instances, you might want to run Ellie weapon instead of birds. But both skills are perfectly viable options to use for DPS. So that's it for this video. Hope you guys found it informative. If you guys have any questions or have any sort of suggestions for bar setups for my Magicka Warden, please feel free to leave them down in the comment section below. And I will see you guys in the next dungeon.